My lease agreement was coming to an end, and the owners of the home decided they wanted to sell it after the lease was up. This left me with no choice but to find a new place to live instead of renewing, as I had planned. It was incredibly frustrating, especially because they only gave me a month's notice. Not nearly enough time to find a new house while juggling a full-time job. The first 2 weeks flew by, and suddenly, I was left with just 2 weeks to secure a house, pack, and move. I was stressed out of my mind. Time was running out, so I desperately applied to 3 houses nearby without even touring them. 2 declined me, but the 3rd accepted. From the pictures, it was clear the house wasn't nearly as nice as my current place. But in my rushed and desperate state, I had no choice but to take it. I rented a U-Haul and moved my belongings as quickly as possible. After hauling everything inside and arranging the furniture, I finally took a moment to look around. The reality of the house hit me hard. It was far worse than the pictures had shown. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the entire place looked aged and neglected. The rent was cheap, but it hardly made up for the dismal condition of the house. Exhausted, I decided to set up my bed and crash for a quick nap before dealing with the mess. What was meant to be a short rest turned into a deep sleep, and I woke up groggy but well-rested around 9 p.m. checking my phone. I saw a text from the landlord welcoming me and telling me to call if I needed anything. I was too tired to respond, and an angry call about the house's condition would have to wait until the morning. Hungry, I went downstairs to make something to eat. Turning the corner into the living room, I froze in my tracks. Standing in the middle of the room, staring straight at me, was a man. "What the hell?" I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. It was dark, and I couldn't make out his face clearly, but his posture was unnerving. He just stood there, motionless, his blank expression sending chills down my spine. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned around and walked out of the front door without a word or a glance back. He wasn't in a hurry, which only made the situation more surreal and unnerving. My instincts kicked in, and I ran to the door, locking it behind him. Heart pounding, I called the landlord, but he didn't pick up. I peered through the windows, scanning the yard for any sign of the man, but he seemed to have vanished. My thoughts raced. Should I call the police? Something about the whole encounter didn't feel threatening, just deeply confusing. Unable to focus, I tried to distract myself by unpacking. For boxes later, I was still on edge. Then came the knock. A slow, deliberate knock at the front door. I crept to the door and turned on the porch light. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. There was a long silence before a voice finally replied. "It's me, your landlord." I opened the door a crack, and my stomach dropped. The man standing there looked strikingly similar to the intruder from earlier. My pulse quickened. "Hey, did you need something?" I asked hesitantly. "I just wanted to check if you've settled in nicely," he said with a wide smile, his hand resting against the doorframe. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied. "I was just about to go to bed. We can talk tomorrow." I began to push the door shut, but his hand pressed firmly against it, stopping me. His smile widened, and in that moment, a wave of fear crashed over me. Without thinking, I slammed my body into the door, closing it before he could react. I turned the bolt lock just as the handle twisted violently. The man banged against the door once, twice, then stopped. I held my breath, listening. After what felt like an eternity, I heard him sprint away from the porch. My trembling hands dialed the police as I grabbed my car keys, preparing for a quick escape if needed. Moments later, I heard leaves crunching outside, this time near the back door. Slowly, I peeked around the corner, and there he was. The man stood just outside the glass door, gripping a hammer in his hand. Panic surged through me. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I bolted out the front door, sprinting to my car. Once inside, I locked the doors, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway. As I glanced toward the house, I saw him standing in the shadows, watching me. His hammer glinted under the porch light as I sped away. The police arrived shortly after and conducted a thorough investigation. During the process, I finally met the real landlord in person. To my shock, He bore an uncanny resemblance to the intruder. Even his mannerisms were eerily similar. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were connected. Brothers, maybe? Or could it have been some unhinged neighbor or a drifter? I never saw the man again, but I lived the rest of my lease in constant fear. Every creak, every shadow became a potential threat. When the lease ended, I packed up and moved out without hesitation, leaving that cursed house behind forever. I'm 19 years old, and this happened a year ago. I still live with my parents, and I'm an only child. For my whole life, we had lived in the same house in a very average neighborhood. But last year, after I finished high school, my parents decided to move us to a new place. It was a few hours away in a less urban town. They had talked about the move for months, so it wasn't a surprise, but leaving the only home I had ever known was strange for me. The new house was drastically different. While it was technically in a neighborhood, the houses were separated by several acres of dense forest. The land was huge, with winding driveways and tall trees that cast shadows everywhere. A couple of weeks after we moved in, my parents left for their annual business trip. They traveled across the country together for work, leaving me alone in the house. I was old enough to manage, but being alone in a large, unfamiliar house surrounded by trees felt unsettling. It was summer, so I didn't have school or any obligations to keep me busy. The first day dragged on as I tried to entertain myself with YouTube and Netflix. By the second day, I had run out of things to watch. I spent some time outside on the porch, sitting on the chairs my parents had set up, enjoying the quiet. It wasn't long before I noticed a man near the street. Our driveway was long, so the road wasn't close, but I could see him standing just outside the entrance, partially hidden by the trees. He was staring in my direction. I hesitated, then raised my hand and waved, thinking he might be a neighbor. Instead of waving back, the man quickly turned his head, as though embarrassed or caught. He pretended not to have been looking at me, then walked away. The interaction left me uneasy, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he had just been out for a walk or lost in thought. I waited a few minutes to see if he would return, but he didn't. Shaking it off, I went inside and spent the rest of the day playing video games and heating up a frozen meal for dinner. That night, I stayed up later than usual. I can't say the exact time, but it was probably around 1 o'clock or 2 a.m. when I finally went upstairs to bed. I had trouble falling asleep as I had the night before. I lay with my eyes closed for nearly an hour, tossing and turning. Just as I began to feel drowsy, I heard it. Footsteps on the porch outside. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The steps were deliberate and slow. Then came a soft click, followed by the long, groaning creak of the front door opening. I sat upright in bed, heart pounding in my chest. Couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. The sound of footsteps reached my ears again, this time inside the house. They were faint, as though whoever it was trying to stay quiet. Finally snapping out of my shock, I got up and locked my bedroom door. I crouched behind the bed frame, holding my breath, listening. The intruder moved through the house slowly, their footsteps deliberate and cautious. Then came silence. I strained my ears, wondering if they had left. But the next sound shattered that hope, the faint creak of the staircase. My stomach dropped. They were coming upstairs. The steps grew louder as they approached the top of the stairs. Then they stopped. I stared at the gap under my bedroom door and saw a shadow, someone standing just outside. They didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Were they listening, trying to determine if I was in the room? Eventually, the shadow shifted. The footsteps moved away, heading toward the master bedroom. I held my breath, listening intently. The intruder didn't open the door. Instead, they seemed to pause outside, just as they had with mine. Then the footsteps returned, moving down the hallway past my door. I thought I was safe, but the sound quickened, heading downstairs. I stayed frozen, terrified it might be a trick, that they were waiting for me to make a mistake. I waited for 30 minutes before I finally summoned the courage to leave my hiding spot. I crept to the door and unlocked it. The house was eerily silent. I tiptoed downstairs, my heart racing with every step. The front door was wide open. The intruder was gone, leaving no sign of who they were or what they wanted. I called the police and my parents immediately. The police arrived quickly, but as you might expect, there wasn't much they could do. The locks showed no signs of forced entry. How the intruder got in remains a mystery. My parents speculated that when the intruder saw the master bedroom door closed, they might have assumed someone was home and decided to leave rather than risk it. To this day, I still don't know if the person who broke in was the same man I had seen earlier by the driveway. Their intentions remain unknown, and I'll likely never know what they plan to do. After the incident, my parents installed new locks and added a chain bolt to the doors. Even with the extra security, I couldn't shake the unease that lingered. The creaks of the house at night sounded louder, and every shadow seemed to move. I haven't had another encounter like that, but the memory of that night has stayed with me. Every so often, when I'm home alone and hear a noise, I find myself holding my breath, waiting for the sound of footsteps. As a fairly young adult, I had just purchased my first home. It was a small house on the outskirts of town, modest but full of potential. I dreamed of slowly renovating it over the years and eventually selling it for a profit. Beyond the practical aspect, I was thrilled to finally have my own space. The previous owner had left the house completely empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, just bare rooms waiting to be filled. Moving from a one-bedroom apartment, I didn't own enough to fill even a single room of the house. My entire move was completed in less than half a day. By evening, the house still felt cavernous and strangely hollow, a stark contrast to the cramped coziness of my old apartment. I knew it would take time to adjust, but there was something slightly unsettling about living in such an empty space. That first night passed uneventfully, though I struggled to sleep. The house was old, nearly 70 years, and made its fair share of noises. Creaking floorboards and groaning pipes echoed faintly in the silence, making me hyper-aware of every sound. I chalked it up to the quirks of an aging house and eventually drifted off. The following day, I spent hours unpacking and organizing. I set up the essentials, my TV, kitchen appliances, and a few pieces of furniture. By 8 p.m., I was exhausted but satisfied with the progress I'd made. I settled onto the couch and turned on a movie, finally ready to relax. About 15 minutes into the film, a loud thump reverberated through the ceiling. The sound was so sudden and forceful that it made me flinch. It felt as though something heavy had fallen on the floor above me. Confused and a little on edge, I paused the movie and went upstairs to investigate. The rooms upstairs were sparsely furnished, and everything was exactly as I had left it. There were no heavy objects that could have caused such a noise. I checked every corner, but there was nothing out of place. The sound lingered in my mind, gnawing at me as I tried to finish the movie. Was it a structural issue? A loose beam? I convinced myself it was nothing serious and went to bed. I woke in the middle of the night to a rhythmic creaking noise. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as I lay there, the sound grew more distinct. It was coming from the hallway. My chest tightened as I swung my legs out of bed and tiptoed to the door. The creaking continued as I opened the door, and my heart dropped. The attic door, which had been flush with the ceiling, was now hanging down, swaying gently back and forth. A narrow wooden ladder extended from it, as if someone had just climbed down. Panic gripped me. I bolted past the attic ladder, my heart racing, and headed for the stairs. As I reached the halfway point, I heard hurried footsteps pounding across the upstairs floor. I froze, adrenaline surging through me, as the intruder ran down the hall and out the back door. The screen door slammed shut behind them, leaving the house eerily silent once again. I locked the door, my hands trembling, and called 911. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way. While I waited, I felt compelled to ensure there was no one else in the house. Against my better judgment, I climbed the attic ladder, flashlight in hand. What I found was chilling. The attic was filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and piles of trash, all of it looking like it had been there for decades. Yet, Among the debris, I noticed signs of recent activity: a blanket, an empty food wrapper, and a few scattered items that didn't belong to me. When the police arrived, they inspected the house and attic. They concluded that someone had likely been squatting in the house while it was vacant. It wasn't uncommon, they said, especially for older, unoccupied homes. They reassured me that the intruder was probably gone for good, but advised me to keep all doors and windows locked. The police may have been right, but the sense of unease never left me. Every time I returned home from work, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone could be hiding in my house, just as they had before. I became hypervigilant, checking every room, every closet, and every dark corner. Even now, the thought lingers in the back of my mind. The house may be mine, but I can't help but wonder who else might be watching, waiting, or hiding, without me even knowing.